I often look for silver linings around COVID. The good thing about COVID is that because it has forced us to move online with most of our work, we are able to be far more accessible to a far larger number of people. And so for that, we are thankful. My name is Debbie Douglas. I'm the Executive Director of WCASI, and I'm joining you from my home in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Maple, and many other First peoples. I also want to acknowledge my ancestors who were enslaved and brought to the Americas over 400 years ago, including here in North America, in Canada. I commit myself to continuing the solidarity work that they undertook with First Peoples as they work towards their liberation and ongoing resistance. Welcome to our Dismantling Anti-Black Racism in the Nonprofit Governance sector. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speakers this afternoon. I'm sure many of you know both Emmanuel and Liban. Emmanuel Mellis is the Executive Director of the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, NABC, which is located at York University and is the principal of Aman Consulting. Aman brings more than 25 years of senior management experience and expertise in settlement and immigration, community health, community development, community peace building, funding, and philanthropy. Aman is joined by Liban Gebremichael, who is the first Executive Director of Taibu Community Health Center. Gebremichael has over 25 years of experience in the primary healthcare sector, social services, mental health, and community capacity building and development field. He has worked as a social worker, child and family therapist, project coordinator, and therapeutic group facilitator with various primary care and not-for-profit organizations working with racialized and marginalized populations. We look forward so much to both of your presentation and our conversation this afternoon. Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, my sister Debbie, and thanks to the WCASI team for inviting Liban and myself to spend an hour and a half with you today to reflect together on how we can actually dismantle anti-Black racism within the context of governance in the nonprofit sector. I think I can speak for Liban when I say that we're coming with the spirit of learning ourselves and been in this journey with many of you. It's really great to be in communion, so to speak, this afternoon with so many of the sector leaders, so many familiar faces and friends that we have had the opportunity to work together over the years and continue working on this important area of endeavor. What we're going to do is I will get us started by asking Bev to run some polls so that we can get a sense of a number of things related to our conversation today from people in the room who are participating. And so I will take the lead to kind of bring us, if you want, up to speed, and the poll is showing up there. Thanks, Bev. So we'll take a couple of minutes or less to allow you to complete the poll so that we can share the results of the poll and use that as a means to contextualize a little bit the conversation and the engagement this afternoon. I will be trying to bring us quickly on the same page on some fundamentals around governance. And then we will be talking a little bit about anti-Black racism, how anti-Black racism manifests itself. And then my brother Liban will be talking about a number of things to try to really deepen this work from an Afrocentric value as it's related to also to the work around anti-Black racism. I think beyond just a webinar, for me, this is so important because, you know, governance is so central to the success of our sector. And more importantly, I think it gives us an opportunity to pause and say, how do we embed the fight against anti-Black racism in all facets of our work, whether it's operationally or governance, or, you know, working with our board of directors to really put an advocacy lens to this work in the sector. So there are a lot of, beyond just the acquisition of skills knowledge about this issue, there are a lot of implications why this work is important. So please take a moment to complete the poll, and then we'll get going. As you complete the poll, for those of you who are able to join next Monday, November 9 at 1 p.m., OCAS is also organizing a 1-hour learning exchange where I will be in attendance. And that learning exchange is meant to be almost like a coaching session, an engagement where you could bring some more areas for discussion or any support in terms of how you could apply some of the skills and knowledge that we're going to share with you today. So I'm trying to get a sense, Bev, if what's the level of participation? If you
75%.
75%. I think we should get going. So with 75%, we have good participation. And if you could kindly share the results of the poll, then we'll look at those together.
People are still voting.
Yeah, let's give them a couple more minutes.
2 minutes. There's
some people have
okay. We are with 75% response rate, you know.
Let people vote. Let people vote, man.
Free the vote.
Oh, gosh. I don't want to stay for another days to count the vote here, my brother.
I think we're good now. There's 20 people.
Okay.
Lisa has votes.
Great.
Okay, I'm gonna end the polling.
Okay, beautiful. So that's great. So we have a good number of folks that had passport training. That's great. And, in terms of the level of board experience, you know, we have a good mix. Actually, we have 50% that are at advanced level, which is great. And then an equal number of people that are this is their first experience as a board, or they have been in 1 or 2 boards, which is great. And then I can describe the fiduciary responsibility. That's great. So we have the majority of people are at comfort level with this, and about 30% or so that are at yes, but some level of it. That's great. So that will make our life easier, so that we can quickly move with the discussion around anti-Black racism here. Yes, you can describe, okay, this is an area that we can spend some time. Partially is the majority that have responded in terms of describing anti-Black racism or understanding. Board culture, an important area that we're going to touch today. I can describe what board culture is. That's great. Most of you do. And about 27%, you know how it contributes to a culture of inquiry at the board table. And a small number are actually in need of greater discussion, maybe around board culture. So this is great. And so we have a fairly informed board participants around governance in this webinar, which is great. So let's delve on this. I think without going into a level of detail, and I think Liban and I are committed to share the resources that we're using with you today after this webinar, and any additional resources that we might make reference in the course of our discussion. And I think some of it could also come to the learning exchange session on November 9. So there are 4 important roles and responsibilities for board of directors, irrespective of what type of board you have. The board has the ultimate responsibility to really establish the identity and direction of the organization by literally, leading the strategic planning process and validating the mission and the vision and the direction of the organization. The board has the responsibility to make sure that enough resources or necessary resources are at the disposal of operations or the executive director or the CEO in order to implement the vision and the direction of the organization. And this could be from, budgetary resources to in-kind resources, all sorts of resources that are needed to literally implement the direction of the board. The third important role that the board has is to provide oversight on a number of fronts, from financial to HR, to volunteer, to relationship, government, funder relations, all these areas that require oversight. The board is there working with hand in glove with the executive director to make sure that there are instruments and mechanisms of oversight in place. Now, when I always do governance training and reflection in the sector, I remind folks that actually the number one responsibility of boards is to take care of themselves. If they take care of themselves, then they are able to take care of the other three important pieces of providing oversight, ensuring necessary resources are in place, and establishing identity and direction. And they do that, they take care of themselves by having a number of practices around board operations, from really having clarity of board roles to having, a mechanism where the board assesses its impact and performance periodically, a number of, protocols and policies and practices that ensures that the board takes care of itself. And I think this is where we also start talking about what are the necessary structures that the board has to fulfill its roles and responsibilities. So always I advise boards to have at least a committee, whether we call it a board development committee or a board nominating committee, whatever the name we gave it. This is the committee that throughout the year takes care of the various things that the board needs to do in order to have strong board operations. So more or less 4 pillars in terms of roles and responsibilities for boards, as understood in the nonprofit governance. Now, there are a number of fiduciary responsibilities that board have, and reminding ourselves that nonprofit organizations are legal entities that exist actually either in the Canada Corporations Act or the Ontario Corporations Act. There are a number of expectations around fiduciary responsibility that boards have to pay attention to. The duty, again, we're going to share with you a very detailed document here that goes into a level of detail around this. But just as a reminder, the duty to act honestly is important. The duty of loyalty is important, that once you join a board of directors, you're loyal to the organization, principally. And the duty to really act in good faith and exercise diligence, yeah? And the duty that you recognize you have power and you can exercise power. And there are a number of ways that board of directors do that in terms of exercising fiduciary duties, yeah? The duty of obedience, that you're required to actually, as a member of the board, to make sure that the organization that you're running and providing oversight adheres to applicable laws and legislations out there and some of the provisions that you have in the Corporations Act. The duty to avoid conflicts of interest, critically important, and boards do that by having good policies and procedures and practices in place to avoid conflict of interest. Not that known is this concept of the duty to continue. And it's often that, people, when board of directors are struggling, one of the common behaviors of members of the board is to exit the scene, so to speak, to resign from the board. But there is a reminder here that once you are on a board, there is this duty of continuity, that resignation doesn't necessarily remove personal liability while you are on the board of directors. So we have the duty to ensure that actually governance continues. As I said, we're going to share with you a resource that details this at a level that would be helpful. Now, when you look at governance from an anti-Black racism lens, it's very, very important at the elemental level to be on the same page to understand what the heck is anti-Black racism, And I remind people that anti-racism, the fight against anti-racism is important, and intersections around gender and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and homophobia and all sorts of hate towards various groups that are different, whether due to their sexual orientation or ethnic origin or ability, disability. There are all sorts of dimensions of diversity, for example, in us in Ontario, that are really enshrined as a code in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Yeah? But anti-Black racism is a distinct form of racism. And I think it's embedded in policies and practices of Canadian institutions that reflect and reform beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination directed specifically at people of African descent. That's why it's anti-Black. It's not just anti-racism. It's directly targeted at people of African descent. And it's historically grounded. And we're living in that ongoing legacy. You've heard my sister Debbie's in her land acknowledgement and ancestral history acknowledgement, making reference to the ancestors and to the experience of slavery in Canada. So the experience of anti-Black racism is not a moment in time now, or it's not here because of post George Floyd. It's in Canada, it's historical. It's very important to recognize that, yeah? It exists both in unconscious and conscious biases held by individuals, people, and institutions in various systems, whether it's healthcare or policy, retail or education and what have you, child welfare. So it's both conscious and unconscious in itself, in its existence. But it's also important to know how is it manifested. It's manifested directly when people express and espouse racist views directly. You're at the receiving end of that as a people of African descent. But also it's unconscious. It's and that's the one that we need to pay also attention, where subconsciously people hold negative attitudes toward Black people of African descent based on existing stereotypes and assumptions of people of color, in this case, people of African descent. But also it manifests, and this is the challenging aspect of it, in a systematic way or in systemic way. It's institutional in nature, where it's pervasive, and it's in those interstices of institutions that is a product of individual attitudes and beliefs, and that concerns our folks of people of African descent, and it legitimizes certain assumptions, stereotypes, and practices within institutions. So when you think about really confronting or fighting anti-Black racism, you need to address all these three ways that anti-Black racism that's manifesting itself in terms of direct, unconscious, and systemic. We just concluded a week or so ago a national conference on anti-Black racism, when we explored some of these issues in terms of really how do we actually elevate the bar in fighting anti-Black racism. And we cannot do that if we don't pay attention to how anti-Black racism manifests itself. So at this stage, I'm going to invite my brother Liban to take us from here. Liban, the floor is yours.
I made sure I was not going to make that mistake of starting talking without unmuting myself. And so thank you, Aman. Thank you, Okasi, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here among yourselves to talk about this important and engaging discussion around governance and dismantling anti-Black racism around governance space. And just wanted to share some of our experiences in doing this work in the community to try to address some of the systemic barriers that are faced by Black communities in the city and beyond. My section, I kind of titled it The Black Governance and Leadership because it's around building capacities in different areas. And one of the things that we did when we started engaging in this area of working, we identified that the impact of anti-Black racism on nonprofit organizations and communities served by organizations kind of have three main areas where those capacity building work needs to be done in order to address and confront the impact of anti-Black racism and governance. The first one that we identified was a lot of, some of them long-standing, but most of them emerging grassroots Black-led community organizations doing a lot of work with communities because they are closer to the communities and providing all the necessary support services, engagement, but either not thriving because of lack of resources, but also dying once the resources that they have received ends. So a good example would be for many of you, you would know this with the Youth Challenge Fund, a lot of organizations being funded, like Black-led, youth-led, emerging groups coming and doing a lot of work through funding, and then dying once the funding ends. And so because the structure and the capacity that they have around governance and sustainability was not as strong. The example of the Youth Challenge Fund is over 150 groups and grassroots community groups were funded. And today, about 15 years down the line, there are only, I think, 3 or 4 organizations that are existing. So all that 100 and something have just disappeared because of lack of capacity. So one area where we can dismantle the impact of or address the impact of anti-Black racism is building capacity around governance and leadership among Black-led organizations, group, and groups coming together and doing the work. And that's very, very important because the systemic issues is what is creating that problem in the first place. The second place, and as probably many of you know, the challenge we have around Black representation on different boards in the city, in the province, in the country. I don't know if people have seen a recent report that came out of Ryerson University, the diversity report, showing really some very, very alarming stats about Black representation on different boards in different provinces and jurisdictions. And so a part of the city's plan under the Confronting Anti-Black Racism was to address this issue of the impact of anti-Black racism and increasing the representation of Black community members on different boards and social services. And that's also another area that is very important in building people's or increasing the people's opportunity to be able to occupy space. As the saying goes, if you are not at the table, you will definitely be on the menu and somebody's going to make a decision on your behalf. And so part of the work that we've been doing was training people around the governance 101, just like what Brother Emmanuel just mentioned earlier on, but also adding the anti-Black racism and most importantly also the building the capacity of self-care for individuals, because we know how stressful and overwhelming it can be when as a Black or racialized person, you're the only voice at the table. I mean, I share my own personal experience. Even though, I hold some status and privilege and title, it's still very difficult and overwhelming to be in a space where decisions or policies are made and you're the only Black voice. And so we're also making sure that people have the capacity, the way of coping, and also a mentorship and a network that can support them to do that. But the other most important area of dismantling anti-Black racism is really getting into board processes, existing structures and cultures of board processes, and trying to really move away from this tokenistic kind of checking the box and saying, oh yes, we have members from racialized communities on our board and we're good to go. And we know that that is not really what is happening, because if that was enough, then we would have advanced in a lot of areas by just having people represented on different boards. And so in our approach to doing governance capacity building work in the communities, these were the 3 areas that we had identified. And the focus, particularly as we're talking about disrupting the anti-Black racism in board governance spaces, we in our proposal to the city, we had identified at least to develop a module to engage mainstream organizations and looking at how their processes, their policies, and their culture is conducive or not conducive to advancing anti-Black racism as one agenda item that the board can take on. And so we were very fortunate, I would say, or very strategic and deliberate, but we had the first opportunity of engaging the Toronto Board of Health in this conversation, and we believe it has been a very successful and impactful session that we had with them. Of course, COVID changed the way that engagement happens. These kind of conversations and discussions are best when they are managed on a personal space where the engagement, the personal kind of presence is very important. But I think we managed to do that virtually, and we will continue to do that. And it's beginning to gain a lot of interest from other organizations as well. But the component that is very important, because governance 101, just like Emmanuel just described it, doesn't change whether you're Black focused or not Black focused, or you're serving Black organizations or not, right? Your fiduciary responsibilities, your oversight responsibilities, your strategic planning responsibilities, your engagement might be a little bit different in terms of relationship building and stakeholders, but those fiduciary and legal responsibilities do not change significantly. What changes is how and the focus that you have, and making sure that the component of anti-Black racism exists somewhere in those processes and policies of governance. And so how that can be done is, number one, having those uncomfortable conversations. And we put that out there because it could be uncomfortable, not always, but we tend to think that it should be uncomfortable to have those conversations around anti-Black racism, and looking at the 3 levels that Emmanuel has been sharing earlier on, in terms of the personal, the institutional, and the structures, and looking at where we are in all those areas of our reflection. And what we use is a self-reflection exercise and time spent as a pre-engagement reading and reflection, but also during the sessions that we provide is self-reflecting, because if we don't start with ourselves, and we did this with the small groups that we led, right? We could be Black-led organizations, but that's self-reflection of where we are around the different kind of racism, and including anti-Black racism, should be a starting point of reflection. And that's where we always start. As much as we would do some kind of governance assessment, or where that organization is, or where the board is in certain areas of anti-Black racism, we always start with that uncomfortable conversation, but also the self-reflection and identifying where we stand, where we are, and how much awareness do we have as board members individually, and as board members as a unit moving forward. So that's where we start. And we kind of have this kind of a stage of a process whereby we start with acknowledgement, which will require the self-reflection, the uncomfortable conversation, and acknowledging, number one, that anti-Black racism exists. Number two, that anti-Black racism exists within our space, within our organization, and then that anti-Black racism exists within the sector or the population that we serve. And then from that perspective and conversation, we move into the space or the stage where we talk about accountability, right? So that once we know, once we have reflected, once we know we carry privilege, and sometimes some, you know, beliefs and prejudices that we hold either because of our upbringing or because of what we learned in our school system or because of how society has created those privileges and prejudices. Then we move into accountability and saying, okay, what is my personal role and what is the role of the board and what is the role of the organization in making sure that we are going to be addressing this. And we talk about accountability as a way of uh, uh, a relationship building with communities. One of the most important foundation is if a board or an organization wants to do anti-Black racism, and they're, you know, like if they are not Black led and Black serving, or the you know, a Black focused organization, even then, I would say it is very important to have a relationship with the communities that we're serving. We cannot do this work just because we have made a statement out there to say, you know, the board stands against all forms of racism, but particularly anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism and stuff. That looks very good, but without the relationship building with those communities, the actual work cannot begin. So the accountability stage and phase of engaging either boards or leadership in that conversation is to make sure that from acknowledgement, we are going to move into accountability. And for most of you, I know, and I've seen some of colleagues there, we as an organization, we have an accountability agreement with our funders. And the funders are making sure that we're going to be accountable to them by giving us certain kind of conditions that we have to fulfill, whether it is our reporting, whether it is our finances, whether it is our performance targets, and all those would be laid out in our accountability agreement. And that's how we are being made accountable to our funders or the government. With anti-Black racism, the accountability is actually reversed, because we should start thinking about being accountable to the community, and the community should dictate on what kind of accountability measures that we have to provide to them to show them that we are accountable. And this really requires a significant shift in paradigm and in thinking and in approaches. And you know, if we have time, we can go into some of the things that we have done here as an organization. But from knowledge, we have to move into accountability, identify those areas where we're going to say we're going to do some work as a board, as an organization, as a direction, as a policy, and then hold ourselves accountable to the community. If it is anti-Black racism, then we have to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to the Black communities that we serve. And in order to do that, we have to develop a relationship. And that relationship then would help us to move into the next stages of making sure that we're not just ticking a box to say, we've done the anti-Black racism training and we're good, and we just review it again at the next performance self-evaluation of the board and say, oh, we need to do our you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion training, and then tick a box again. I think we need to move into some kind of an action. And there are two ways that boards can do some anti-Black racism and dismantle anti-Black racism in their spaces and in the leadership. One is around advocacy, right? So one role that boards have is advocating on behalf of stakeholders or members or moral owners, however you described it in your kind of governance policies and models of governance. But that should be the role of the board in terms of moving to the next step, right? So how do we become advocates of Black communities and Black issues that are addressing? After becoming, you know, knowledgeable and acknowledging where we are, after making ourselves accountable, and then moving into the advocacy piece. And then the most important but ultimate area of a board, when the board will have dismantled the anti-Black racism, would be to move into an allyship position, right? We know the difference between advocacy and allyship, right? So advocacy is speaking on behalf of communities or populations, but the allyship is, or developing an ally relationship is creating the space for the communities to be able to do that. And that would be the ultimate aim of governance if they really are very serious in advancing anti-Black racism and dismantling the anti-Black racism. Brother Emmanuel, if you could advance the slides. And so, so part of what we introduce in our conversation when we are engaging with boards is, so when we say Afrocentric values and principles, what do we mean, right? There are certain principles that we really bring into conversation at the board level to be able for them to frame the way that they can think about addressing anti-Black racism. And this could be, what we call the African-centered leadership models and values and principles that are there, with the restoration of sovereignty, with the Sankofa principles of, willingness to take up the struggles of Black leaders who were left off. If you can advance the slide. The Ma'at restoration that includes core principles around justice, order, harmony, balance. That could be principles that we use within our boards, for example. These are the kind of principles that we can introduce for processes, for decision making, and it can be introduced, but it's also the principles and values that we should keep in mind when serving our population, when creating a direction for the organizations, particularly those organizations that are serving racialized and marginalized communities. We're talking about Black communities right now, and these are the kind of things that we are thinking about. If you could move to the next slide, Emmanuel. And then the other thing that we also have been working on is the other principles, right? So we talked about the Ma'at restoration, the Johari Sita principles, and then we talk about the Kwanzaa principles as well. And as an organization, we've really looked at these principles and brought them into our governance and our programs to identify what it means. When we're talking about self-determination as an African value and principle, what do we mean, and how is that going to be manifested in our governance, in our operations, in our community relationship, in our programs and services? And so we will make sure that no decision is going to be made without the community's voice. So nothing about us without us would be something that we would incorporate in our governance principles or operational principles or organizational principles altogether. Making sure that our purpose would always include anti-Black racism and intersectionalities of the different social determinants of health, or the holistic approach when you're thinking about Imani and spirituality, is that individual health is not just the physical health, the social, emotional, spiritual, and other kind of health are also incorporated in our philosophies, in our approaches, in our evaluation metrics. And so when the board, as a board, also, these are the kind of principles that we can think about and say, how are we making sure that our policies or direction to the executive director or CEO will have incorporated this as a way of quality monitoring or reporting requirements, right? So there are certain things that the board can implement in their direction to the operational, but also in governing themselves and processes by adopting these Afrocentric values and principles. If we can move to the next slide, maybe, Emmanuel, thank you. And then the other important thing that we're also incorporating in this dismantling anti-Black racism in governance of nonprofit organization is to think about systems change, because you know, I think it's ever so clear that you know, the challenges both as an organization, as a board, as operations that we were facing with anti-Black racism is systemic. There is no, you know, if and buts about it. We know that, and in our engagement to address these issues, by and large, we have, and because the system works that way, we are sometimes very limited by thinking about programs and activities and funding and sustaining the organization to continue the work, because most of the organizations that are doing this work are under-resourced and are always looking for capacity to be able to do this kind of work. But that is not really taking us anywhere significant or bringing about significant changes, because we're just doing program and activities, and nothing changes in the system. And so we're always looking for funding to do the program to address the impact that the system is continuously doing that. And so I think we need to shift our focus and approach the other way and look at what would bring some kind of systems change, right? And we're thinking about structure. And you know, that's where the governance is going to be very, very important, is that's where some of the changes should happen. It's around the policies and the practices and the resource flows, because that would be the decision from governance. It's also what Emmanuel was describing earlier on in terms of the different levels of the anti-Black, the manifestation of anti-Black racism, where it's happening at the structure and institutional level. These are the areas that we need to start paying attention to. And then the second area where the relational as well is also very important for boards to consider, because it's the relationship that the board, as ambassador of the organization, builds with stakeholders in other areas to build that relationship. And so that's where changes can also happen. And then also looking at the board governance and power dynamics and how decisions are made, both at the board, at the operational, and at the program level. I will give you a very, very quick example. We have developed a seniors engagement project that has been going on for about 6 years now. It's called the Ubuntu Village Project, and it's engaging seniors so that they take over their own health promotion, if you like it, by being active in what they need to see happen in their organization. And what we have done is they have created their own structure of decision-making process, and there is now what they call the Ubuntu Elder Council that decides everything and anything that is related to that particular project. And we had to learn and change the way we think and change the way we do work with them by removing ourselves from decision-making. So the power dynamics, shifting the power dynamics to them. And I've made you know, a decision internally to say, if it doesn't involve health and safety issues or any legal risk or any financial implication outside of what has already been allocated as their budget, then we as an organization do not need to make any decision. They can make a decision as to what they want to do. And the fruit of that has been now is that whenever they have programs and initiatives in the community, we have a problem with space, because they're all very engaged, and this is about their program and not a program that an organization has created for them to participate. This is a program that they have created for themselves to be involved, and it is very owned by themselves. So those kind of thinking where boards should also change the dynamics of power relation and communication, and also as an organization. I probably kind of stop there because I've been talking too much, and maybe there are some very good questions out there. Maybe this would have been a teasing just to engage some conversation going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Liban. Thank you, Emmanuel. Folks, comments, questions? I know that there's been active discussion happening in the chat. Great to see. Thank you all who shared your resources and your comments. comment on what you've heard or a question that you may have. And just unmute yourself when you want to speak.
Hi, it's Kelly McKenzie here from Silent Voice. We provide services to members of the deaf community. So I think my question is always about intersectionality, because members of the deaf community come from all over the world into Ontario, where they are provided services by us, and from all other demographic, diverse backgrounds and histories. So I've really appreciated what has been said so far, but I'm also, and I'm very aware of the need to identify anti-Black racism as a, or that anti-Black racism exists in its own entity, separate, and cannot be lumped in with just being anti-racist or racism. But we also have the intersectionality of Black deaf people, of Indigenous deaf people, of immigrant deaf people, of deaf people living in extreme poverty, like the whole gamut. So I just wondered if you wanted to touch on intersectionality at all.
You can go, Liban, and maybe I can segue or I can.
So I think intersectionality is very, very important, and you know, if you recall one of the slides we make sure in terms of our purpose, anti-Black racism, social determinants, and the intersectionality of those different issues, whether it's you know, what you just mentioned around deafness, other kind of ableism and ability and disability. Areas of LGBTQ plus, areas around Francophone, areas of newcomers, right? So in our approach, we always make sure that it's not a homogeneous group that we're thinking about. That's why in most of our communications, we'll talk about Black communities, because they are diverse within this, right? Some of the experiences may be similar, because of the outward facing challenges that they face. But within that, there are several intersectionalities that we need to think about always. And it's a very important point to raise in our conversation. And in our language or in our communication, we'll make sure that we say Black communities, because, you know, there are people who are coming from the African diaspora continental African communities that are different from the island, right? Even in terms of accessing information, accessing services, being at tables, right? There are some further marginalized. So it's very important to look at those as well. And we try to do that. But maybe I think what I'm hearing is we should be more explicit in putting out the diversities within the Black community that exist, so that they are not left behind. And I hear that clearly. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, and that's why it's important, this approach that we have been advocating was almost like in the context of Black communities, using a Black ecosystem approach. If you take an ecosystem approach, what it allows you to do is it allows you, first of all, to remain open to learn about the different dimensions of diversity. And we don't have to go far. I mean, the Ontario Human Rights Code is very detailed in terms of the dimensions of diversity that we must pay attention in terms of intersectionality. Yeah? But beyond that, then we need to be able to do intentional things with attention again, to be able to not only raise the awareness, as we did in our conference recently, we spoke about the value of raising awareness, as we're trying to do today. But more importantly, to follow the data, to do the analysis and say, for example, when we talk about deaf communities, in my own community, I do volunteer with one deaf family, for example, and I can, a newcomer family at that, I could see the intersections of many isms in terms of the impact on this family, yeah? And the important thing is, like, it's the action. Where do we go from here, yeah? And I think we need to be able to really, and then there's a comment that Sister Janelle has put there in terms of, we need to look at the underlying causes, yeah? A lot of our work around advocacy, anti-Black racism, anti-racism programs and services kind of deals with the tip of the iceberg. And what we need to do is, like, you know, with care, courage, and compassion, we need to be able to say, it's time for us to have difficult but necessary conversations about this work. And we do that by having the skills, the knowledge, the experience of various people, as we're doing that today.
Other comments?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Janelle. Go ahead.
Because I'm using my phone, not my computer, so I wasn't sure. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this topic. I think it's so important. Unfortunately, I have another webinar to get to, so I have to leave in 4 minutes. So I just wanted to slip in and say that I think, you know, when we say having difficult conversations, and there's such a high number of people that don't really have an understanding of what anti-Black racism truly is and how it's rooted, then I think we have to go back further than that to address it in terms of how governance is structured and so on. Because, you know, when you look at it, you make a lot, I think we make a lot of assumptions about how governance is supposed to be rolled out. And if you're really looking at the experience of Indigenous and African people, then some of those structures are by their nature exclusive of your existence. And so if we start with thinking or the assumption that those structures are taking for granted, this is the way that a board has to function, then I think that we're going down the wrong road. So we need to start questioning those assumptions. And so the slide that you had, Liban, when you were speaking about the different values, that's exactly where the conversation needs to start. And so the difficult conversation is not about your own personal racism or the organization's policies, are they racist and are they barriers? But what are the assumptions that we are making that in and of themselves are a barrier to the inclusion of people? It's at the level of ideas and it's at the level of structure. It's from the starting line. We have to kind of erase what we think we know and really listen and understand how would we structure our organizations differently if we were taking into account more of the experiences, including those of intersectional oppressions. And so with that, I have to go soon.
Great.
Yeah, those are great points, Janelle.
If I can just
Alicia, sorry, I was muted. At least you have the floor.
Thanks. I just want to thank Janelle for her comments, and they really resonate with me. So I come not from a settlement or a social service background. I come more from a strategy background, and it's like, are we dealing with the symptoms, or are we actually getting to the root of the problems? And I see this really as a multi-tiered issue. So I think that in the settlement sector, there is a false sense of that boards can say, well, we're diverse because we support a diverse population. And I think that there's a comfort level saying, well, we support everybody, so we're already checking off that box. And it's not about who we serve, it's when we make decisions, how are we making sure that those voices, those values, the history and the experiences are being considered? So it's not just a matter of, in my opinion, of using the data, it's collecting new data. And it's actually having funding for different types of groups. I also think that it's very easy for this, as it was raised by Kelly, for this to be lost in this whole intersectionality of trying to represent other groups. So until I worked with the Indigenous community, I was totally ignorant on the Indigenous community. I assumed it was one community, and I did not see the multi-layers of all the different communities. I think with Black Lives Matter, this whole movement, it's done the same negative thing, because on one hand it's created awareness, but it also lumped everything in one bucket that people can pat themselves on the back and saying, okay, I've done this, I really get it, and they don't. So I think what OCASI can do in a very meaningful way is provide experts that can come to boards to really educate the boards. And as was said by Janelle, really talk about the values and about the context. And I think that would be meaningful not only for the boards, but for the staff. And we're doing internally a whole rethink about this inclusivity and what does it mean. But that would be, I know, meaningful for my team as well. But it's finding the experts that can really talk, because there's not a whole plethora of the people that really take this approach. So that I'm just throwing out there to be considered.
Your recommendation has been heard, but these webinar series that we're doing, Elise, is exactly what it is that we're wanting you to invite your boards to. Because as I said, 3 years ago, we recognized together with St. Stephen's and the City of Toronto, now St. Stephen's, now the neighborhood group, and the City of Toronto, that this kind of conversation was really necessary. And at Ocasio, we certainly saw the need to drill down on issues of racism and specifically anti-Black racism, given the moment that we're in, especially. Aman?
And I think this is really deep, meaningful conversation and discussion that I think if in another discussion around governance, we have, if you notice today, we have not even touched what type of governance model should we look at. What is the relationship of these governance models with this discussion around anti-Black racism? But we've been encouraging in the work around governance for people to, yes, fiduciary responsibility is important. The strategic responsibility of the board in terms of the vision and the future of the organization is important. But we also talk about this issue called generative governance, the capacity for boards to actually free up time and energy in their practice, in their board meetings, the way that they engage among themselves to have generative conversations. A generative conversation is a conversation that we're having now.
Mm-hmm.
A conversation of substance and consequence, yeah? And traditionally, boards are so busy clocking from one meeting to another, reviewing administrative reports, and by the time that they have 5 minutes, the meeting is over. If they look at their culture, and that's another piece around the culture, is culture manifests in the meetings, in the way meetings are conducted. People are preparing for meetings, in the way that the agenda actually allows you to yes, take care of your fiduciary and strategic responsibility, but have enough time to delve deep in a topic and say, hey, what is the ambassadorial role, for example, for our board when it comes to the allies around the fight against anti-Black racism? What are the 1 or 2 things that we can do? And so my encouragement for boards is to take culture seriously, because in fact, as it's been said, culture, it's strategy for breakfast, yeah? If your culture is really, one that you're intentional about, where you're fostering collaboration, where you're fostering dialogue, when you're fostering a culture of inquiry, have the energy and the time to be able to delve deep on some of these things that we're engaging. I think for me, the value of the last slide that Brother Lieben shared around systems change, and the slide that I shared around how anti-Black racism manifests, where if our board of directors, they need to recognize that they are not just providing oversight to an organization, they are providing an oversight to an organization that is leading in a space called the system. And I think it's very important to be able to encourage board members to see their role beyond just their close organization. They are part of a larger sector community process that we're talking about movement building and change.
If I can add another area where I think we're also doing some work and is also important is around recruitment for board. And that's an area that I think should also be given some attention based on the practices that exist, and partly also is used as an excuse not to engage and involve racialized and marginalized community members in their space, right? So that is like an entry point where you can either open up and engage better, or close and not allow people to come to the space. And usually when I go and speak to organizations and I look at their board composition and who they're serving, you see that the kind of great difference between who they're serving and who is making decision about the services that is happening. And I ask the question, say, so how come, you know, this neighborhood, this area, this organization, this is your clients that you're serving, but none of the people are, or it's not well represented on your board. And they will say, oh, we can't find people from the community. But how they do that is what is you know, like that's where one of the challenges are. They're using recruiting firms who have no relationship with communities, or communities don't trust those pathways and processes. And then, you know, often I hear the term used as, you know, like skill-based. We have a skill-based metrics, and lived experience or community knowledge is not part of that metrics, right? It has to be the kind of, you know, as Janelle was speaking earlier on, what is traditionally been accepted as value and valid for opportunities. And that those are where conversations should also happen. And if an organization has a very good relationship with the communities, there's no reason why they cannot find somebody to represent that community on the board.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. When you talk about board culture, what is that? What is that? How do you feel and touch it?
In terms of it, as I said earlier on, I hinted a little bit about, you know, culture is not tangible. It's not a concrete thing. It's happens in that interface between people, where people engage to one another, and in the context of board experience, where does it happen? It happens in board meetings. It happens in terms of who prioritizes what gets into the board agenda. It happens in terms of the dynamics of power at the board table. And part of the discussion around culture is also related to the provisions in Ontario, in Canada, to what is expected in the Corporations Act. That the board of directors at the end of the day speaks with one voice. You might have dissent and you know, different perspectives, but at the end of the day, you legally are one entity act. So if that's the case, then at the board table, power is distributed equally among the members. And I think many board members who don't understand this, they defer authority and power to executive officers of the board. So the board is a collective entity. And I think in terms of culture, it happens around how you prioritize, and what happens at your board meetings, and what type of engagements you have among ourselves in terms of the dynamic, whether there's a monologue versus a dialogue at the board table, whether there are few voices that are actually carrying the day as opposed to a collective process. So the other thing about culture is, and I might bring this to our learning exchange next Monday, is we need to recognize that people have different styles. There is the pain in the neck member of the board who wants to really have every detailed information. That role is needed at certain times. There is the analyst at the board table. There is the facilitator at the board table. There are different styles. And that's why at the beginning of the year, the board development committee exercise could actually develop a map of the different styles of board members that you have, because it has a contribution to the culture of the board itself. And I think it's important to be able to, without naming names, many years ago, I sat on a board whose way of fundraising was, going for a violin concert, in someone's house to raise money. That was not the place and the culture and upbringing I came from, yeah? So I could not fit into that. But I had the opportunity to have a chat with some of the board members so that they understand that I'm not the outlier there in terms of this, because board culture is an important consideration in terms of how people relate to one another. So I think that much I could say, but there is a tool that I can share maybe Monday, or I can send it by email to be shared with the group, about board culture. There are pillars of building a culture of inquiry around the board. There are styles of board culture that we need to pay attention so that when it's necessary, we give the benefit of the doubt to the other because we know the style.
Yeah, so folks, if you want to see that resource, show up on Monday to our learning session, learning exchange session with Emmanuel as our resource person, and you'll get the resource there. Also, you're going to have to wait until next week to receive it, if we so. Any other comments or questions? This is good. In the chat? Yes, Elise.
I don't think you could have a culture of inquiry at the board if you don't have it in the organization. I think that it really needs to be throughout. So like we made a decision last year on cultural sensitivity that we did it at the volunteer and staff level. And then we said, well, wait a minute, it needs to be at the board level. You can't do one thing on one side of the organization and then expect it to take place in the other. So either you have a learning culture also in your organization that's going to allow for difficult conversations, but you can't have it on the board only because then they're going to impose things on the staff that they can't handle. So it really needs to be in tandem to work, and everyone needs to know there's going to be a lot of mistakes in the process. So I know when I took my role at JIAS 20 months ago, first thing I did was said that our board maybe reflects the communities we support, but they really don't represent our full client base. And so we started to make changes to our boards. For the first time in 97 years, we put a non-Jewish board member on the board. This year, from the 3 candidates we invited to the board, 2 accepted, but 2 were non-Jewish, invites. They represented communities that we really felt a connection with, but they couldn't just come on because they represented the communities. They needed a skill set that the board needed. And otherwise, they're only going to be a checkbox. If you only bring people on just to say that you're being inclusive, they're not going to get the respect of their peers. They're not going to be really included at the way they needed to be included. So we've made a lot of changes. And just from my experience, we created board committees this past year where we invited people that we thought we need to hear their voice. We started off at a committee level on the board, so they're non-board members invited. And then when we saw how great they were, we said, we need this person on our board. So the person wasn't chosen to be inclusive. The person was chosen because we realized that that person could add so much to that conversation. And they're embraced in a very different way when you do it that way. So I'm not saying it's the right answer, but I think there's got to be a caution of trying to go and pivot the organization quickly because it's going to have sometimes negative repercussions.
What do folks think about that? Emmanuel, you're shaking your head.
Totally, because the focus is on governance. Governance and operations are hand in glove. So I think whatever happens at the governance table definitely has to, be influenced and influence what happens in terms of operations. The work that Peter Singh has done years ago around the learning organization, and the recent work that he has done with others around, around pushing this concept of system leadership, And I think it's almost like, especially during this pandemic, with the challenge of the sector around recovery and post COVID, it will be an utter wastage of opportunity here if we don't reframe organizations in the sector as anchors of change, as places of civic engagement and change. So, and that's why it's very important to relate this governance discussion around anti-Black racism to the larger societal change that needs to happen. And board of directors, beyond just their monthly meeting and committee activities, they need to see themselves as ambassadors of change and to be able to really be the voice out there that really push for inclusion. They need to be able to lead by example, a lot of sector leaders, they are talking with different levels of government around the recovery of the sector. And we need to equip board members with the skills, knowledge, tools to be able to have not only a conversation, but lead in that space,
Yes.
Can I ask a question? Question to Elise. Is it Elise?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on that in order to bring those community members into the board, they needed some kind of a capacity building around the skills. their skills to join the board, I think, and maybe I'm assuming, I don't want to assume, but if you could just let us know what that involved and what kind of skills they required. And then the second question would be, were there any skills that were identified that the board did not have but needed in order to engage those community members in an equitable manner? If my question makes sense.
No, absolutely. So this all started with a risk management. So the starting point was I did a risk management audit. And when I did a risk management audit, it came out that we weren't being inclusive, or we thought we were being inclusive. So it was like, then the question is, who do we need to hear from? What does inclusivity look like? The risk management audit also made us aware that there were areas in the organization that we didn't have the funds to hire a VP of, ABC, but we could bring in board members that could give us those insights. So we made a list this was a shopping list of things that we really needed to strengthen our board with. In parallel to that, I got the Rotman School of Business, their MBA program, to do an onboarding and do an independent audit of the governance of our board. Because I knew that no matter what I recommended, it would be healthy to have an MBA student in parallel to do a recommendation. And they did an incredible job on that project. So there were skills that came out like cybersecurity. It just happens that the person who's a cybersecurity expert who's going to be coming on our board was, somebody who was one of the groups that was part of the constituent groups that helped us bring in Syrian family members. So not only do they come in and they give us the whole understanding of the refugee communities that we work closely with, but also happens to have the Syrian, so it happens to have the cybersecurity background. So there was a number of checkboxes. We're not going to bring someone on a board just because there's a checkbox and they can say they understand finance or HR or cybersecurity. They also need to be committed to the values of the organization. They need to have an understanding and an appreciation of the role that immigrants play and the challenge that they go through. And they need to also be willing, and we put this up front, to be an ambassador. They have to be willing to talk about the issues, and we will train people on that. And so it was kind of like a multi-tiered initiative where we started to say, we brought in somebody right away that was if I could share with you my secrets that worked really well. We stopped going to the regular suspects to ask who to put on our board. We went to different people for names. Like if you always go to the same 5 people, you're going to get the same communities being invited. So we went to new communities and we said, look, we need skills in this area. And our preference would be to have people that don't represent everybody else on our board. We're looking for more diversity. So can you please recommend people that come with those skill sets? And we got great names that we never would have considered before. And what was amazing for me is how my board embraced it, because it was done in a way that wasn't accusing, it wasn't making them feel like what they did in the past wasn't right. It just gave them a mechanism to do it. What we've learned from other organizations, because I did a best-in-class survey, is other organizations told me, if you want your board member to be really successful, let them sit on a committee first for a year, because then they don't go in like with the deer without, on a headlights. You're getting them to get to know and build friendships and relationships with board members. You're getting that trust happening across the organization. They're getting to shine in a very safe form. It's easier for someone to speak up when there's only 6 people or 7 people in a committee than it is in a board setting. And then what we did is we started to do things of like board retreats, where we started to invite people that we saw as potential board members, even for a year or 2 down the road, that represent communities that we feel like we're not having at our table. And this way, at least if they're not on the board, they're going to help us understand the direction, or at least ask questions in a space that we need questions being asked. But it boils down to the fact you need to have a board chair who's not afraid of having questions asked.
Yeah, great. Kelly, did you have your hand up?
I think I have a scary question to ask, because I'm going to put myself in a vulnerable position here. I understand tokenism. I understand that boards have a number of people, a limited number of people. So I'm just going to throw out a scenario. Silent Voice is not as connected to the Indigenous deaf community in Ontario as we'd like to be. We are up in Attawapiskat and in northern communities, but not in Toronto. So this is my little scenario. We do outreach. We have deaf community members from Indigenous communities involved in Silent Voice. Maybe one of them wants to become, a committee member or a board member. What is the pressure of them representing the deaf Indigenous? Like, it's too big a thing. They can't be that voice. And I understand that you still have to have more than one person on your board. You have to have this relationship with the entire, communities, but there's a lot. We just talked even about Indigenous communities not being like one community. So it's just that responsibility of either the person who's listening or the person who's providing some narrative of representing a big group of people when they're not.
That is such an important question around issues of representation and who it is that we expect to be representative. But I will leave it to our brilliant presenters.
I like the way you started and says scary question. So we all paid attention. But I think the idea of representation is I think it's a session by itself, because there is merit to have those kind of individual representation, but representation is not just because somebody is on the board, and the burden that that person could also hold by representing everybody out there is also a huge difficulty and challenge that sometimes is put on people, right? Together, and it goes with the tokenism, right? You identify one person from the community, you put them on the board, and then you say, okay, solve the problem, this is your problem, right? So that is also a very, very difficult situation. And that's why in our conversation and in our thinking, we want to move away, we want to move towards this place where the advocacy and the allyship are going to be very important component for the board. That way, especially if you move to the ally relationship that you have, you can build that relationship with different communities where you then allow for them to occupy spaces when need be, other than you or the board taking that responsibility because you're putting one person that may or may not have a relationship or a communication with this diverse community. So that is, I think, the way that we should approach it, because it's very difficult, as you mentioned. You put somebody on a board, and then there is an expectation from everybody that that person is going to represent all this diverse community.
Yeah.
They can't.
Yeah, and you're right, Levan. I think the point of representation, as opposed to inclusion and a culture of really inclusivity, for me, it's a value and principles driven discussion. So if an organization has really embedded some of the indigenous values, for example, or some of the principles around indigeneity, yes, you might not have proper representation at the end of the day, and you cannot represent it, but your values and your principles will actually take you to organizational behaviors and engagements that are different because you have really embraced the values. Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I co-chaired a conference on Indigenous, non-Indigenous Canada with a young Aboriginal leader. And the first thing that we did, we actually engaged Aboriginal leaders across the country to really ask them a basic questions like, how do we do this right? And what they offered back to us was a set of principles of how we should guide the entire conference planning process, including, not only the preparation, but also who speaks and how, people speak and how the engagement and presence of Indigenous leaders throughout every facet of the conference. So I think for me, we should go back to principles and values and say how to embed them in the work of our organizations.
That's a great place to end. Thank you so much to our two presenters, Emmanuel Mellis, Liban Gebremichael. Monday, November 9th at 1 p.m. The link will be sent to all participants on this call. Emmanuel will be your resource people to have more of these conversations, to do a deeper dive, to have the hard conversations, or what Kelly calls the scary, ask scary questions. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to seeing you on other webinars as it has to do with our governance training. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Leben.
Thank you, Debbie Ocasio, and thanks,
you,
my brother.
colleagues.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your input.
Okay.